Our second panelist is my dear colleague, Randy Bass, who's an associate professor and executive director and assistant provost for teaching and learning initiatives of the Center for New Designs and Learning and Scholarship, CANDLES, which encourages innovation and new teaching models at Georgetown University. His current activities include the Visible Knowledge Project, which is a national research project on learning and technology in the humanities, and the book, Hyperactivity and Under Construction, Learning Culture in the 21st Century. He's received numerous awards and fellowships, including the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and the EduCause Medal for Outstanding Achievement in Technology and Undergraduate Education. Thank you, Randy, for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Jim and Brian, for getting me involved with Project Rebirth. I have a feeling it'll be a very long involvement. I'll be very happy about. Kathy said that this is really all very experimental, that we really are just trying to figure out what is the educational value of these tools. So in any good experiment, you always have to have a control. So I'm the control. So Kathy and George and Bernie are, what happens when you have people with actually some expertise working with these materials, and I'm the control of what happens when somebody with no expertise actually works with these materials. And so that's my role. And I used Project Rebirth, the film materials, in a course I taught in the fall that was just a first-year writing course that I had created new. I hadn't taught this course in a long time. And I wanted to use the Project Rebirth materials, so it seemed like a perfect match. I knew nothing about these materials, and the students know nothing, and so we see what would happen. And like most of my teaching, I really didn't know what I was doing. I just thought, we'll just try this and see. And Project Rebirth really made two appearances in this class. This class, my approach to teaching writing, we did some of the usual things you'd expect in a writing class, but really what I was interested in was the question of what does it mean to write? What does it mean to speak? What does it mean to have a voice in the 21st century? What does that even mean to understand language as embodying meaning? What does it mean for a person to embody their own knowledge and their own values? So to me, that's what writing is about, and that's where I saw the Project Rebirth materials fitting in. So just briefly, and I want to use some of my students' words to kind of give you a quick arc of the course. The first time that we used Project Rebirth was on September 11th. This was in the fall. And Brian Rafferty came in and screened the trailer that you saw for my students. And then immediately when they had finished screening, I asked them to write blog postings as a response to the film. And I just want to read you one, and I can't tell you how many people wrote responses that were very similar to this. She says, I felt like I had gotten over September 11th. Isn't that terrible? I know the profound impact it had on the lives of so many people, but I thought that I had finally situated the tragedy in a place in my mind where I could control and anticipate my response to it. As it turns out, I'm not as numb to it as I thought. We are repeatedly bombarded with talk of 9/11, and as a country, I feel we've healed. The difficult part to cope with is the personal side of the story. Regardless of how nonchalantly we carry on with our day on September 11th, with just brief moments of remembrance, it is impossible not to be moved by a big, burly firefighter tearing up over his lost friend, or a teen who has lost his mother but somehow found a way to move on. When I heard the stories of those included in the film, I couldn't help but feel a swell of empathy. How are these individuals able to cope? How is it that they move forward in their lives while still remembering those they've lost? All I can surmise is that human beings are much more resilient than we think. Hope can pull us through amazing tragedies, and that is just one of the beauties of the human spirit. When I read this, I thought, oh my God, she's channeling Jim Whitaker.
I was kind of thinking,
In fact,
wow.
I think I emailed that to Jim.
You did email it to me, but it's powerful. Really powerful.
So many weeks later, we came back to Project Rebirth. We did many things in between, studying the notion of writing as a social act of conversation, studying the election, other kinds of things. And then we did a unit using Vital, and thank you, Kathy, for taking the time to show us how that works. We used Vital. The students worked with the clips, long clips, short clips, wandering around. I gave them assignments to get smaller and smaller. Now find 30 seconds that captures what you just found 5 minutes to capture, et cetera. And then finally, the final assignment with the Project Rebirth clips was to create, we were doing this under the umbrella of what I called the rhetoric of trauma, and trying to study Project Rebirth tapes as examples of people trying to speak through their trauma. And so the final assignment was they each had to write a 1,000-word essay, picking 3 clips that coherently fit together so we could assemble the whole class's 1,000-word essays into one, what I called a listening guide to the Project Rebirth tapes, to imagine they were helping others hear these tapes. So for me, what I see is the value of Project Rebirth to doing something like teaching writing in the first year, to opening up this notion of language and subjectivity, was really 3 things. One was as a way to get students to slow down and to listen, and to really listen, and to watch the clips over and over again and hear something they didn't hear before, and to also to understand how every utterance is in a very complex act between each of these subjects and the audience they're speaking to. I just want to read you one brief one, and then I'll read one to end. Someone is going back and looking at Nick, the young guy who lost his mom. He's telling the story of how he builds this relationship with his squash coach, who's also had a loss. And the student writes, continuing, he progresses his story and changes the mood of his story as he retells how he approached his squash coach. Something I noticed was that he sighs when explaining about the squash coach's relationship, as if he were telling this story for the millionth time. But he knows these details are necessary for his audience, because his conversation with the squash coach is where he found out what was going on and where his real trauma begins. The second thing that I think that students really get out of this is they really develop a very interesting sense of language and the registers of language. And I have many examples, which I won't share here, of how they hear the interview subjects using language in ways that in high school they only think of are going metaphor hunting in short stories for your English teacher. But they start thinking about things what one student called personalized imagery. So that's another dimension of the rhetoric of trauma. And then the third thing that I think is really powerful, and I'm sure is common to all of us, is as a way of helping students develop a sense of empathy. And in this case, for me, empathy is deeply related to complexity, complex grief. Alice talked about complexity. Having a sense of what you thought was simple as being very complex, it seems to me, is the path to empathy. And as an English teacher, one of the things that I most like to do is to put complex texts in front of students that have what I would consider a surprising complexity. And I think the Project Rebirth tapes have a surprising complexity. So let me just finish by reading you one more. This is the last paragraph of the paper written by the student who wrote on September 11th, I thought I was all done with September 11th. So this is her last paragraph of the paper at the end of the semester. These 3 clips of Tim are very limited and focused examples chosen to support the claim that trauma and the following processes of healing happen in a cyclical manner driven by human resilience. That is, traumatic events happen to people with definite identities. However, through the experience of suffering these identities are often lost or questioned. The main struggle in any post-trauma narrative is the fight to define a new identity so the affected can once again feel whole as a person. Although the whole will not be a whole made up of the same parts that existed before the tragedy, the survivors will strive to piece together the portions of their former life that still make sense in conjunction with the new roles that help them cope.
Thank you, Randy.